You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com.au. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester and our program's Community Voices. Our guest today, Bronwyn Kelly, a very committed public policy specialist who spent her life in public policy at various levels of government and in various fields, and who these days operate a small think tank here in Sydney called Australian Community Futures Planning. She's just launched January this year, 2026, her new book, because she's written many before, and this is a substantial piece of work, it must be said, titled The Public Interest Economy, a short handle for it that I'm labelling it as Democratizing the Australian Economy, although it's got a longer one. It's full of the most fascinating propositions about how we could improve things for everyone in Australia, our lifestyles, if you like, our well-being, our security, and even the sustainability of our society and economy if we did things differently, particularly in the areas of economic policy and government. So thank you very much for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches, Bronwyn.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Bronwyn, the basic motivation for putting together this considerable body of work that spans just about every area of government policy and institutions and puts forward a very substantial and integrated reform agenda. I'm just wondering what the motivation is that led you to believe that the Australian economy needs to be democratised. What are the symptoms of our economy that show that it's not a democratised economy?
From 2000 onwards, basically, the way we managed our economy in Australia has shifted. It's shifted towards neoliberalism, which most people, I think, understand as less government involvement in delivery of services, privatisation of public services and assets, unregulated capitalism, unregulated exploitation of the environment, things like that, a free market focus. Now, that focus hasn't necessarily done Australia proud, mainly because our well-being has been declining in that period. And so in most of the work that I do, I show how on a large number of indicators, Australia's economy might have grown, but our well-being has got worse. It hasn't delivered an improved quantum of well-being. So if you just take a couple of examples there, growth in poverty in Australia over that period since 2000 is scary. It's in the 10 years from 2015 to 2025, we've gone from 3 million people living in poverty to 3.7 million people living in poverty, including 757,000 children, which is a shocker. And the wealth of the top 20% of households is now 90 times that of the lowest 20%. Not 19, that's 90. It's another shocker. All our health has been declining, particularly physical and mental health. Our access to education has been declining. And as a result, the proceeds of the economy, we work hard every day to build up the economy, they're not being fairly shared, and there is increasing inequality, which is the proof of a lack of democratic influence in economic decisions. So now we have an economy that after 25 years of that, or 30 years of that, it's set up more to favour markets, and particularly financial markets, not people. It's especially not set up to favour full employment anymore. It was at one time, but it's not now. So there's also been a growth in democratic inequality, which has generally aggravated the inequality in the economy. The influence of big corporate donors and the lobbying industry is now severely overshadowing the influence of individual voters. And we have one other rather distressing underpinning problem in the economy, and that is that a big decision maker in the economy is not elected. We don't have a democratic economy. The Reserve Bank, is the decision maker with the most influence in the economy in terms of cost of living and opportunities for employment, but it doesn't and it can't do a good job on those indicators because it doesn't have the tools to drive decision making about the economy in the public interest. All it can do and all it does is adjust interest rates, and that hasn't been effective in achieving either of those objectives for inflation management or for employment. The bank is these days more accountable to itself and the banking sector than it is to either the government or the people of Australia. So they wouldn't like hearing that, but it is true. The way the RBA operates at the moment is that it favours a financialised economy. It favours an economy where, for those who make money out of money, it's not favouring a productive economy, meaning it's not favouring one where people make money out of employment. So it's for those of us who need employment to make money, the economy isn't set up at the moment to work in our favour. So the RBA is not inclined to be driven by government policy. Instead, its decisions have favoured the banking sector. That, again, they won't like hearing that, but it's true. So the other big thing about how we don't have a democratic economy, the testimony to it is that Australians can't design the agenda for their preferred economy. If we had a democratised economy, they would be able to do that. So in the book, I concentrate on giving them everything they need to be able to design the economy they prefer. Basically, I give them instructions so that they can carry on conversations about the economic issues they're facing at a national level. So I'm giving them the assistance they need to be able to run those conversations themselves and set up a good agenda to build the sort of economy they want.
Your underlying analysis and reason, as I hear you and read you, is that you think that as a result of the application by our political classes and in our policies of this, what you're terming neoliberalism economic approach, this way of thinking about the economy and society, which you're saying has dominated for the last 30 years or so, it might well have generated overall growth and wealth and richness, but it hasn't really been shared equity for the improvement of life of everyday people, from their well-being to their jobs, their social security, and even ultimately perhaps to the sustainability of the environment and the economy. Trying to change this, as you propose to try to do, where you talk about the sort of different approaches we could take, requires a big change in mindset, doesn't it? About how those who make the decisions make those decisions and think. And at the core of that mindset change, you call for a thinking about a public interest economy. Now, what would be the characteristics of a public interest economy, and how would it be realised?
In a public interest economy, you would have decision makers aiming for particular things. They'd be aiming for a much fairer distribution of the benefits of the economy and a much fairer distribution of the burden of taxation. There would also be much fairer access to universal services, in other words, services for well-being. And that would mean you would dispense with, for instance, the two-tier system we have at the moment in health insurance, which allows a different degree of access to health services for the poor than it does for the rich. Everyone in a democratised economy would have to have all the access that they need to all the services that they need for safety, well-being and survival. And at the moment, the economy is not set up that way. A democratised economy would also look like an economy that serves the public interest first. It has to serve that first before it can hope to serve the interests of business and the private sector. They're legitimate interests, but unless the public interest is served first, then we're not going to be able to serve the interests of the private sector as well as we might. When you serve the interests of the public sector, in other words, you serve the interests of well-being services like health, education, aged care, childcare, on it goes, everything that we need for social cohesion. All of those services, and I list them in the book, once they're secured, they provide a fantastic foundation for a fully thriving economy. It gives people much more choice about where they can go and get a job that will give them life satisfaction. And it gives business much more choice about how to make money without actually consuming resources faster than they can be renewed. So we want to stop that in the economy. It would also look like an economy where people, for the first time, can strike up a fair social contract with their governments. And I call this in the book a social New Deal, which makes it sound a little bit like the Green New Deals that some political parties from time to time, have offered voters. But it's actually quite different to that. It's a deal that we can offer to governments. So it works the other way around. This is a deal about how we raise public money and spend public money and what we spend it on, but it's the community who's setting the terms of the deal, not government. So the book gives people the processes and tools they need to be able to craft that deal, any deal they want, as long as it's fair. That's the only real limitation on crafting a social New Deal. It's got to be fair to everyone, including to the government.
Our guest on Community Voices Radio Northern Beach is Bronwyn Kelly. We're talking about her latest book, just launched here, January 2026, The Public Interest Economy, about democratizing the Australian economy and a safe path, as she describes it, to enhanced well-being, more employment and economic security through jobs and wages, and a more sustainable, perhaps, economy and environment. You're talking about the public interest economy there, Bronwyn, and you mentioned a whole range of public, what we have come to regard as public sector services in the past, education and health and what have you in particular. But of course, many of these services are provided today at great expense to taxpayers and to people who can access them, but they've all been largely, or a lot, have been privatised. Does this mean that a public interest economy would have to step back from all that and resume all that back into a public sector provision, does it?
In an ideal world, yes, the privatisation of essential human services probably wouldn't have occurred. This doesn't mean that the private sector can't be involved, but it does mean that the for-profit parts of the private sector, well, it's really inadvisable to involve them. And yes, so if there are for-profit providers providing those services that have, been privatised over the years now, it's not in the public interest that they should be continuing their involvement in those industries. So yes, you would take them back, but you wouldn't exclude the non-profit parts of the private sector. We rely on them and can continue to rely on them. The problem is letting the profit seek in. That's where the rot sets in, basically. If you have a for-profit provider providing services essential for well-being, then they're always going to put the profit first before the people. That can't work. So yes, that has to be reversed. It will cost us too much in lost well-being if it's not reversed. I would reverse it specifically in areas like employment placement contracts and anything that touches a human being. It's not advisable to have for-profit providers. So yes, you would reverse it there.
This agenda of yours, and part of it we're discussing there in health and education and other services, would involve big changes in public finance, either the raising of more taxes, a larger public sector share of the economy and of GDP, a lot of debt and debt servicing and deficit financing. All of this would overturn a lot of the conventional ideas that have been in place and are in place, macroeconomic policy-wise and governance-wise, and would require a completely different way of thinking, wouldn't they? Is that what you're promoting, that we have to think about these particularly macroeconomic factors in a different way economically to the way that governments have been?
Yes, definitely. What we have at the moment is a neoliberal system where everything's too skewed heavily towards the private sector and particularly the financial sector. To turn that around, I've come to the conclusion in the book, although I didn't start out thinking this, but by the time I'd finished writing it, I came to the conclusion in the book that we have to do exactly the opposite of what we're doing, which might throw everybody into confusion, but it is a simple matter to reverse what we've been doing. If you imagine, for instance, that neoliberalism has not just stopped us improving our well-being, it's actually led to a decline, significant decline in our well-being. If you want to reverse that, then it would be a very good idea to do the opposite of what we're doing now. So I explore in the book two completely opposed frameworks of economic management. One is what is called neoclassical economics, which suggests that we are limited by a lack of funds, that a government must run itself like a household and must balance its budget. And the other suggests that we are not limited by a lack of funds, and that in fact, as long as we can physically do it, we can afford it. So I oppose these two types of economic frameworks in the book, and there's quite a lot of detail in there that you can get summaries of how these two camps are opposed to each other. One is populated by neoclassical economics, the other is populated by post-Keynesian and modern monetary theory people, and what's called functional finance, which is something that a lot of people don't know about, but I hinge a lot of the reforms proposed in the book on functional finance, which is a different way of running the macro economy, the macroeconomic level. If we can reverse the way we run the macroeconomic level, and this would involve reversing what we do in prioritising monetary policy, like let's not prioritise interest rates anymore, let's prioritise full employment. Reversing all that would lead to a greater set of opportunities for Australians and definitely a greater level of well-being. I also think it would actually lead to a far surer form of being able to control inflation. So in the book, I suggest that interest rate policy is not effective in controlling inflation. What controls inflation is tax, and therefore fiscal policy, spending and taxing, government spending and taxing, delivers you a manageable economy with price stability and full employment. That's what's promoted in the book.
You do indeed, in great detail, go through these different approaches and contrast what is with what might be, at least from your point of view, in the way you've said. A particular manifestation and implication of what you argue in this domain institutionally, you've made some mention to the role of the Reserve Bank, which we've used to being seen as a very independent body setting monetary policy independent of government. But you call, basically for the removal of the independence of the RBA and the merging of the monetary responsibilities of the RBA into the Treasury, along with the Treasury's existing fiscal, in other words, tax and expenditure responsibilities. It's a very radical proposal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a radical proposal if you're steeped in neoclassical economics and neoliberalism. Yes, it's not a radical proposal at all. If you think about what I'm really proposing in the book, is the independence is a fallacy. Independent from what? I mean, they might be independent from government policy, but do we want them to be? And are they independent from the financial sector? And do we want them to be? Well, yes, we do want them to be independent from the financial sector. They're independent from us, which is a big problem. You don't want them to be independent from the public of Australia. And I think that independence is in itself not what actually secures good decision making. What I'm actually suggesting in the book is that there should be a rearrangement of the way we manage fiscal and monetary policy, and that should be integrated. Now, that means that you need the Treasury and the Reserve Bank working together, not working in separate silos as they do at the moment. And at the moment, we have a situation where the Reserve Bank is calling all the shots, and it's really cramping the ability of the federal government to be able to use its tools, which are fiscal tools, to be able to manage the economy as much as we should and allow it to. So to get those two things together is what I'm proposing. So there's a major sort of proposal in the book that actually puts the two back together. Stop with the silos, you break down that wall. Otherwise, what falls in the cracks in that wall? That wall is there and you've got two institutions on either side of the wall, the government with fiscal policy on one side and the Reserve Bank with monetary policy on the other side. What falls in the middle? that nobody attends to, full employment. So actually what we need to do is put them together. So that wouldn't mean that the Reserve Bank would actually do too much different than it already does. They're very skilled people. They do actually know how to tweak interest rates. They know how to do that. I explain how they do that in the book. But it's not everything we need them to do. We need them to integrate that with fiscal policy.
We're speaking here, Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, with Bronwyn Kelly about her new book just launched, The Public Interest Economy, Democratizing the Australian Economy, in just about every facet of policy and government role and responsibility and institutional frameworks for that matter. A key element that you talk about beyond this macroeconomic and governance and whatever is the actual democratization project itself for the economy and how that might be achieved in terms of inputs anyway and who's making the decisions. And you place a lot of emphasis there on the important role of what you say is planning and the reporting and monitoring on planning, but also on the engagement of the community in these processes. What's at the heart of this thinking about how to democratise the processes of the economy?
At Australian Community Futures Planning, one of the things that we've developed and been testing for 5 years now is something called National Integrated Planning and Reporting. And what that does is that it's a process that allows people to become involved in designing their society, their environment, their economy, and the sort of governance that they want. And it's particularly useful in helping to design a national economy. The way we've not been able to do that until now, we haven't been able to let people help become involved in democratic decision-making, more involved than they can at elections. So we haven't been able to let them do that because there hasn't been an orderly way of working out how we could set up an agenda what people want for their economy. So National IPNR, or National Integrated Planning, has been developed by ACFP and tested to see whether it can work to let people into the decision-making process. It doesn't mean that they govern the decision-making process, but it means that they can work out, well, what's our preferred agenda? And how do we set that up? It gives them tools that they can use to do that. And once they can do that, they can present that to government. And it doesn't mean that the government has to do what is said in the plans, but it does mean that they can be guided by it. And it also gives us a yardstick to enable us to assess whether they did things that we think are in accordance with our preferred setup for the economy and our preferred society. Not something that's fashionable in economic circles, and governments certainly don't like it. But unless we do it, we can't get a public interest economy. Unless you tell the government what's in the public interest, you won't get a public interest economy. And the way to organise yourself to do that is to become involved in national integrated planning.
Well, that must be quite a key step in your thinking and presentation, having a process by which you can identify the preferred future of the people of Australia in this case, because, what you put forward could in many ways look like a political manifesto, a political policy platform, but with no party behind it, no strength behind it, which raises the whole question of for whose benefit is this reform? Who wants to buy into it? And what's the pathway for achieving this huge set of integrated institutional and policy reforms? Where's the motivation going to come from, not least against the vested interest and strengths of those who benefit from the current system?
People want change, and so they're looking for something that will help them actually achieve those changes. They don't like inequality. They don't like the growth in poverty. They don't like not having a decent health system. They don't like not having affordable housing. There are all these problems that they need to solve, and they want to solve. They don't like the impending climate change that we've got going. But they can't solve any of those problems unless they organise themselves to say, well, what sort of economy do we want? There is a motivation there. I think there's also a motivation on the government's side. I mean, if politicians just stepped back for a minute and thought about whether they could achieve longevity in office, by delivering on a sort of agenda that Australians have said they want. Australians have organised themselves to say, well, we want this, we don't want this. We want an economy that works for us. We don't want an economy that doesn't work for us. Once they've got that in place, basically governments would be pretty stupid to say, well, why don't I have a go at actually delivering that for them and demonstrating that I'm delivering it for them. That will deliver longevity in office for any party of government that has the nous to follow it. So there's a lot of motivation on both sides. It just has to be organised. And one of the things I suggest in the book is that the next step for something like national integrated planning would be to set up a national commission for it. I think I call this the Independent Commission for National Democratic Engagement and Integrated Planning. This should be set up and it should be funded by the government but not interfered with by the government. It's meant to be a forum where communities and people can just walk in and have a say in these sorts of things in an orderly manner. The framework that is used in National Integrated Planning and Reporting gives them the means to have those conversations in an orderly manner. These conversations should become as regular a feature of our democracy. Once every year, every 3 years, after an election, we should have these conversations as a nation. There should be an institution that is set up to allow us to walk in the door and have them. It's kind of like our free Parliament House pass that we don't get, but the lobbyists do and the corporations do. This one is our free Parliament House pass, but it allows us to organise ourselves so we're not all talking at cross purposes to each other. We're just talking about general aims that we want to achieve and giving our governments some types of principles that allow them to figure out whether a decision that they're about to make about the economy would fit with those principles or not. So it's hopefully we can get something like that started in the next few years. I should say that if we did start something like this, within 5 years, we could set our economy back onto an even keel, back onto a prospect where there is a reduction in inequality, a reduction in poverty, and a much more resilient economy. But I know that, for instance, the Treasurer, Dr. Chalmers, is looking for a resilient economy. He's trying to figure out how to do it. He hasn't quite cracked it yet. And I would suggest that he has to abandon his brand of economics if he wants to attract it, to attack it. But there is a way for him to do it. We can actually achieve this. Within 5 years, we could turn it all around.
Well, Bronwyn, as we wrap up here with Bronwyn Kelly on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, discussing her new book, The Public Interest Economy, Democratizing the Australian Economy. Your critique and your analysis very much of the failings of the economic system, if you like, which you point pretty squarely at what you've called neoliberal and neoclassical economic way of thinking that's dominated government and societal thinking this last 30 years. But it's also an equally, listening to you and reading your book, a proposal and a bit of an indictment of the failings of our democratic institutions and processes, isn't it? And their ability to listen to and reflect what you believe might be the true preferences and wishes of the community.
Yes. I mean, our democratic institutions are better than most across the world, but they really still confine us to voting and protest. Now, they're quite exhausting. Protest is an exhausting process, and voting is probably, well, we don't get an effective say. You get to vote, but it doesn't do anything. Whereas what I'm proposing is that if we have democratic processes that allow us to talk to each other in an orderly manner, and that's what National Integrated Planning and Reporting does, then you can describe an agenda for the economy, and you can present that to government, and you can ask them to take it into account in their decisions. Yes, you can.
Well, thank you, Bronwyn Kelly, for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches to talk about your newly launched book, The Public Interest Economy. I wish you well with the launch and its reception and the discussion it engenders. Thanks, Bronwyn, for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. we've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3, now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.